So look at Anthony Ryder from South Lyon, Michigan, recently selected as the Lions 2020 Fan of the Year. He has a passion about sports broadcasting.
With the 112th selection in the 2021 NFL Draft, the Detroit Lions select Amon-Ra St. Brown, wide receiver, USC. One pride, baby! Yeah! What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to another Detroit Lions video. Now, the idea of adding some extra talent to this Detroit Lions roster is not a new one for Detroit Lions fans, right? After a strong free agency and a strong draft class, the Detroit Lions are looking to be one of the better teams in the NFC this year, but that doesn't mean that they don't have holes on their roster. Just like every team across the NFL, there are positions on the Lions roster that are stronger and some that are weaker, and some fans still have the idea the Lions could continue to add talent throughout the preseason process in order to make their roster that much stronger for a potential division and playoff push in the 2023 season. And one player that consistently comes up is Chase Young, a player that was drafted second overall in the 2020 NFL draft and looked like a really good pick to begin with, but has since struggled with some injuries and staying on the field, and most recently has had his fifth-year option decline, as well as potentially being put on the trade block. So today I wanted to take a look at Chase Young, a player that has kind of divided the Detroit Lions fan base and a player that could potentially be a new member of the Detroit Lions. Now, before we get into it, a big part of why we're talking about Chase Young today is actually the fact that he is the Detroit Lions betting favorite to start for the Detroit Lions next year. So obviously, with him being on the trade block, with there being a lot of trade news about him, he is, as of right now, the betting favorite to go to the Detroit Lions above every other team in the NFL. So with this trade potentially being possible, if not likely, I wanted to take a look at Chase Young as a prospect and potentially take a look at what he could add to this team, as well as whether or not the Lions should trade for Chase Young. Now, starting off with Chase Young as a prospect, Chase Young was a phenomenal player at Ohio State. His final year with the Buckeyes, he had 16 and a half total sacks, 21 tackles for loss, 7 forced fumbles, and ended up going as the second overall pick as potentially the best football player in the country and undoubtedly the best defensive player in the country. Chase Young was a dominant force on that Ohio State defensive line and the defense entirely, as they ranked as one of the top defensive units in college football, as well as Chase Young finishing fourth in Heisman voting and eventually being drafted number 2 overall by the Washington Commanders. Now, Chase Young came in and had an immediate impact in the NFL. His rookie season was really good, having 7.5 sacks, 24 pressures, 10 tackles for loss, 4 forced fumbles, 3 fumble recoveries, on his way to winning a Defensive Rookie of the Year award throughout 15 games of his first year in the NFL. Chase Young got a lot of hype throughout his rookie season. He was talked about as a potential future Pro Bowler, a potential future All-Pro, and a potential Hall of Fame player with the rookie season that he put together. Now, in my opinion, I think Chase Young was slightly overrated as a rookie, right? No doubt that he had a good season. No doubt that he was a good force on that defensive line and was a really good player for the Washington Commanders in his rookie season. But 7.5 sacks for a rookie is pretty, I would say, about average, if not slightly below average for a first-round pass rusher. And even though he was very good, right? There's no doubt he was a dominant force. There's no doubt that he was a good player. There's no doubt that he was one of, if not the best defensive players from that rookie draft class in the first season. I do think that the All-Pro hype, I do think that the Hall of Fame hype really kind of put an overhyped narrative out there for Chase Young and really led to some high expectations that were really, really tough for him to meet as a football player. As, you know, putting Hall of Fame expectations on anybody after the rookie season seems like a pretty high bar to set for a player that we haven't seen a whole lot of in the NFL. Now, since Chase Young's rookie season, he hasn't really been the elite playmaker that he once was, right? Chase Young, over the last 2 seasons, has played in just 12 games of the possible 34. He's played just 593 snaps on the defensive side of the ball across those 2 seasons, and coming away with just 1 sack, 14 pressures, and 0 turnovers forced. He hasn't been the same player that he was in his rookie season, and some of that is due to injury. Chase Young did tear his ACL and did struggle to stay on the field over the last 2 years, as you can tell with the 12 games over the last 2 seasons, right? He didn't play enough games to really be productive, but in 12 games across 593 snaps, you'd still expect to see more than 1.5 sacks. You'd still expect to see more than 14 pressures, knowing that in his rookie season, in 15 games in a very similar snap count, he had 7.5 sacks. He had 24 pressures. So even with the lack of game time, the production and the efficiency on a per game basis still isn't really there for Chase Young. He hasn't been the same player. He hasn't been the same explosive athlete. He hasn't been the same explosive pass rusher. He hasn't been the same elite run stopper. And even though I think he's been good in his return, I think he's been okay as far as being a run stopper, and he's had a couple flashes as a pass rusher. He really hasn't been the elite player, nor has he been the player that everybody thought he was as an elite prospect coming out of Ohio State as, again, arguably the best player in the country in a draft class that featured Joe Burrow and a bunch of other elite playmakers. Now, taking a look at Chase Young. Chase Young has a lot of pros, I think, which is why a lot of Lions fans are willing to pull the trigger, but he also has a lot of cons, right? His pros are he's very young, right? Pun intended, but he is a young football player. He isn't even at the end of his rookie contract yet and still has a lot of time left to become a great pass rusher, still has a lot of time to become a great football player like people thought he was going to be as a prospect, and he's still incredibly talented, right? That Ohio State season was not a fluke. Those 17 sacks was not due to scheme. It wasn't free rushes. It wasn't him just being the last guy on the roster that nobody knew about and he got free rushes and got free shots at the quarterback. Like, Chase Young legitimately won all of his battles and got those sacks, got that production because of how good he was as a player, right? He got those 21 tackles for loss because he was an explosive player, not because he had free rushes. He got those 16.5 sacks because he was a great pass rusher, because he was the best player on the field, not because he got free rushes or because he was schemed to production like some other players on Ohio State and some other players to go very high in the NFL draft over the last couple of seasons. So we know the talent's there. We know that he's still pretty young and still has some high upside, but there is a lot of concern, right? Chase Young's injury history is a concerning factor to any team that's looking to trade for him. He's only played in 12 games over the last 2 seasons, and there's nothing telling us that he's not going to get hurt again. In a very similar way to Jeff Okudah, a player from his same draft class, having those injury concerns early in his career and it plaguing him throughout the entirety of his career so far. Chase Young has had a very similar injury history, right? One major injury, a couple minor injuries that have kept him out late in the season, and all of a sudden, he's not the productive player you drafted out of Ohio State. Another thing that's really concerning about Chase Young is the contract, right? Chase Young is on the final year of his deal, meaning if he plays well enough to earn a new contract, he has all of the leverage to get more money than he's potentially worth because you would have traded assets away to acquire him, right? Now, if Chase Young doesn't play very well, you only have 1 season, or if he gets injured again, you only have a single season to determine whether or not Chase Young is a member of your team for the future, or whether you wasted a draft pick in order to go acquire him. And for a team in the Commanders that's potentially and reportedly looking for a third-round pick and a player potentially in order to deal Chase Young, wasting a third-round pick, wasting a top 100 pick on a player that has known injury concerns is notably less productive now than he was as a rookie, and is just notably less, not talented, but less productive, less of an athlete, and very clearly taken a step back in his development from his rookie year. Risking a top 100 pick on that player for 1 year and a chance for him to get a big contract seems like a massive risk for a team that's continuing to hit well on the draft and a team that's continuing to get a lot of talent through the draft process with the Detroit Lions. That giving away that top 100 pick, giving away a third round pick for a chance that a player becomes what he even Young was as a rookie and gets back to where he was as a rookie is a really big risk for a team that doesn't necessarily need an edge rusher, right? And then the production obviously speaks for itself. Backtracking in production, backtracking in sacks, backtracking in TFLs, backtracking in pressures. Everything about Chase Young's game from a statistical standpoint has regressed over the past 2 seasons from when he entered the league as a rookie. Now, what should the Detroit Lions give up for him, if anything? For me, I think if it's a 5th-round pick or later, you can warrant trading for Chase Young. I think the talent, I think the youth, and I think the upside warrants at least a look in a potential 5th to 6th-round pick, right? Jeff Okudah got a late 5th-round pick for what he did, and I think Chase Young could fetch a very similar profit. Obviously, Jeff Okudah hasn't been to a Pro Bowl. Obviously, Jeff Okudah hasn't won a Defensive Rookie of the Year award, but Chase Young hasn't done those things either in 2 years, and I would argue over the last 2 seasons, Jeff Okudah has been more of a solid starting cornerback and has been more available than Chase Young has been as a starting solid defensive lineman and an available defensive lineman. On a defensive line with Deron Payne, Jonathan Allen, and Montez Sweat, you would expect to get a lot of one-on-one opportunities, and Chase Young has had those opportunities, but he hasn't been able to make the most of it. So for a player that has notable injury concerns, a player that's on the last year of a contract that is going to need to be extended if you give up a draft asset, as well as a player that just has a lot of injury concerns in production, as well as a player that just has notably regressed from a production standpoint, Chase Young is a massive risk. He's not this surefire prospect anymore. He's not this elite playmaker anymore out of Ohio State. He's an underperforming defensive lineman, an underperforming edge rusher that has a lot of talent and a high enough ceiling where you could still potentially give up an asset in order to acquire the player. Now, Chase Young would slide in and I think probably be somewhere between the 4th and 5th best edge rusher on the team. I don't think he's going to play over Hutchinson. I don't think he's going to play over James Houston, at least from a snap count and from a pass rush standpoint. Chase Young and Aiden Hutchinson may start on the defensive line if this trade is to go through, as both of them are really good edge setters and both of them are solid run supporters. But in pass rushing downs, Chase Young might come off the field in favor of James Houston, who in his rookie season as a 6th-round pick had more sacks than Chase Young in significantly less games, right? You still have to give John Kaminsky his snaps. You still have to get Josh Pascal his snaps. You still have to get Romeo Okwara and Charles Harris their snaps. And it's a very deep defensive line, a very deep edge rushing room specifically. And I think Chase Young would get some reps. I think Chase Young would potentially even start some games and play on early downs for the Detroit Lions and be a starter for the Detroit Lions eventually. But you're not getting a every down player. You're not getting a full-time pass rusher to go along with Aiden Hutchinson to be an elite duo. You're getting Aiden Hutchinson with Chase Young and James Houston and John Kaminsky and Josh Pascal and Romeo Okwara all rotating in that edge spot. And some of them might kick inside. Some of them might kick outside and play more of a linebacker role because some of them can do that. But it seems like a massive risk, especially if you're giving up a 3rd-round pick for a player that, one, you don't necessarily need, and 2, has a lot of cons and a lot of concerns when it comes to actually acquiring the player himself. So, with that being said, should the Detroit Lions go out and acquire Chase Young? Should they trade for him, do what Vegas says, and should Chase Young be a Detroit Lion? I think for a 5th-round pick, sure. I think that the odds that you're going to find some players in the 5th round better than Chase Young's floor right now is probably pretty slim. I think Chase Young is a safer prospect than pretty much anybody you're going to find in the 5th to 6th round. So bringing him in, even if it's just for 1 year for a 5th or 6th round pick, makes a lot of sense for the Detroit Lions. I think that he can be a run stopper. I think he can have a role on this defense. And for a 5th round pick, getting him immediately and potentially having another Pro Bowl upside player if he can stay healthy and return to form, the upside is there to the point where you can make that trade. But if the trade talks are a 3rd round pick, or from even things I've seen on Twitter from Lions fans, a 3rd round pick plus Romeo Okwara, it just doesn't make sense from a talent standpoint or really a production standpoint to go out and acquire a player that has that much risk associated with him. So with all that being said, that is all I have for you guys today. Let me know down in the comments below how you feel about Chase Young. Do you want the Lions to trade for him, or do you not want the Lions to trade for him? And if you do, what would you be willing to give up if you were the general manager, if you were making the decision, or even just as a fan, what would you feel comfortable giving up in order to bring in Chase Young from the Washington Commanders and adding him to the Detroit Lions defensive line? I'd be very curious what you guys have to say and what you guys feel about this particular scenario. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. If you did enjoy the content, please make sure you go down below and subscribe to the channel, as well as liking the video. Helps the channel out a ton. If you hit the bell notification, you will never miss a Detroit Lions upload. But with all that being said, that's all I got for you guys today. Thank you both so very much for watching, and until next time, and as always, go Lions.